You won't believe what happened when the cleaner turned out to be the most powerful person in the room. Once upon a time, I found myself in a situation that was both humiliating and infuriating. I was working as a cleaner in a corporate office, and every day I faced insults and dismissive attitudes from the very people whose jobs I controlled. They laughed at me, thinking I was just an insignificant part of their world, unaware that I was actually the owner of the company. Those who mocked me would soon learn the truth, and their laughter would turn to shock. The boardroom buzzed with tension as I quietly moved across the floor, pushing my mop and bucket. My movements were methodical, slow, and deliberate, but my mind was racing, taking in every conversation, every facial expression, and the power dynamics in the room. I was not just any cleaner. I was the silent observer, temporarily burying my true identity to understand what was really going wrong in my new acquisition. From a corner, I watched the men in their suits, many of whom were completely unaware of my presence. They were busy discussing strategies to cut costs, debating which departments to lay off, and how to frame their inevitable decline as a necessary restructuring. None of them knew that their fates were being scrutinized by the one person who truly had the power to make the final decision. I had bought this corporation a few months ago when it was on the brink of collapse. Once a powerhouse in the tech industry, it had crumbled under mismanagement and a lack of innovation. What struck me most while reviewing the files was not the financial figures or the declining market share, but the blatant disregard for the employees, the very foundation of the company's success. My decision to come in as a cleaner was not made lightly. I had spent my life climbing from humble beginnings, witnessing how powerful individuals often overlooked those they deemed unworthy. I built my business from the ground up, working tirelessly, to prove myself in rooms filled with people who often saw only my skin color or gender. The lessons I learned in humility and perseverance had brought me to this moment. It had been 2 weeks since I took up the mop and bucket, and each day exposed me to the same ugly truths: casual racism, snide remarks, and dismissive attitudes. The moment I stepped into the role of a cleaner, I became invisible to the very people whose jobs I controlled. I understood the importance of grasping the real problems within my company, not just from spreadsheets or executive reports, but from the workers themselves. I bent down to wipe a spot of coffee from the floor as the voices in the room grew louder. "We can't keep paying for the benefits packages at this rate," said one of the senior executives, a tall man with a cold expression. His voice dripped with arrogance. "If we cut 20% of the lower-level staff, we could save enough to keep the board satisfied for another quarter." Several people nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on the charts displayed on the wall. My heart tightened. I had seen this strategy play out too many times before. Layoffs that hurt the most vulnerable, cuts that left the workforce depleted and disheartened. One of the men, a mid-level manager named Kwame, glanced at me briefly before rolling his eyes. "Those cleaners," he muttered under his breath, barely audible to the others. "We could cut them too. I mean, they're barely necessary. I don't know why we even need so many of them." The comment stung, but I kept my face neutral, continuing to wipe down a nearby table. I had endured worse in my life, but it still amazed me how easily some people could dehumanize others when they thought no one of importance was listening. I wasn't there to react to petty insults. I had a mission. I needed to understand the rot in this company, and each day of pretending to be at the bottom of the ladder revealed how deeply it ran. In the break room later that day, I sat alone at one of the small round tables, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. Around me, other employees gossiped, treating me like part of the furniture. One of the women, Zainab, an administrative assistant, leaned against the counter, laughing with her co-workers. "Did you hear about that new cleaner?" she asked, her voice loud enough for me to hear. "She's so quiet, barely says a word. I bet she doesn't even speak English." A chorus of laughter followed, but I remained still, my expression unreadable. The comments were familiar, and I had learned long ago to let such things roll off my back. But it wasn't the insults that disturbed me. It was the complacency. No one questioned the casual racism. No one stood up for the cleaner who, in their eyes, didn't deserve a second thought. In moments like these, I felt the weight of my decision to disguise myself. The disdain from those around me was palpable, but it also provided me with invaluable insight. I now knew that the corporate culture wasn't just flawed, it was toxic from the inside out. I would need to do more than restructure departments and adjust financial strategies. I would need to rebuild the company's moral foundation. Later that evening, as I finished my shift, I walked through the nearly empty office halls. The building felt different at night, quiet, almost peaceful. I lingered near the CEO's office, staring at the door with a brass nameplate that still bore the name of the previous owner. In a few weeks, that plate would carry my name, and when it did, I would bring a reckoning no one expected. For now, though, I would continue to observe, to listen, to endure the humiliations and petty insults. I knew that when the time came, every single person who had treated me with disdain would see me for who I truly was, and in that moment, the balance of power would shift. I took a deep breath and turned away from the office, heading toward the exit. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the heavy tension that had built throughout the day. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but think of the coming storm. They wouldn't see it coming. They never did. But I was ready. I had always been ready. The next day began just like the others, with me donning my janitor's uniform and stepping into the office unnoticed. But this time, I felt the weight of my mission more heavily than ever before. The disdain, the casual racism, it was all part of a system I would soon dismantle. For now, though, I had to endure because true change didn't happen overnight. It required patience, and I had learned the art of patience long ago. As I pushed my mop down the hall, I knew that soon the same people who dismissed me would be begging for my attention. The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of the corporate building as I once again assumed my role as an invisible part of the company's ecosystem. As I walked through the corridors in my janitor's uniform, it was as if I had donned a cloak of invisibility to the employees bustling around me. I wasn't a person to them. They didn't see me as someone with thoughts, feelings, or opinions. I was just the cleaner. That fact became all too clear day after day, as my patience and endurance were tested in ways that would have broken lesser individuals. Today was no exception. As I pushed my cleaning cart into one of the conference rooms, a group of employees was already gathered, chatting animatedly about the upcoming layoffs. I moved to the far end of the room, sweeping the floor with deliberate slowness, hoping to stay unnoticed long enough to gather more of their unfiltered opinions. I heard they're planning to cut another 15% of the workforce, one of the women said, her voice dripping with concern. It was Zainab again, the same administrative assistant who had mocked me just a day before. I bet half of these cleaners will be out the door soon. Can you imagine? They're barely necessary as it is. The casual disdain in her voice was all too familiar to me. It was the same tone I had encountered throughout my career, from people who believed that one's worth could be measured by their job title. I remained silent, focusing on my work as they continued their conversation, laughing as they speculated on who would be the next to go. Kwame, the ambitious mid-level manager, who had scoffed at the idea of cleaners the day before, chimed in. Honestly, I don't know why we need so many of them. They walk around like they're important, but I've never seen them do anything that justifies having more than one or two in the whole building. I gritted my teeth, but kept my expression neutral. I knew how easy it was for people like Kwame to make snap judgments about others without a second thought. They were so consumed by their own ambition and sense of superiority that they couldn't see the value in anyone who didn't fit their narrow view of success. As the day progressed, my interactions with my co-workers only grew more demeaning. In the break room, I sat alone at one of the tables as usual, sipping my coffee from the same chipped mug. The room was filled with idle chatter as other employees gathered in small groups, laughing and discussing their weekend plans. I had learned to tune out their conversations, but today the words cut a little deeper. One of the men, a young intern named Tunde, was standing by the coffee machine talking loudly with his friends. I don't get why they keep so many cleaners around. I mean, how hard can it be to clean a building? They just push brooms and wipe down desks, right? My grandmother could do that job. Laughter erupted around him, and I felt my hands tighten around the handle of my mug. I had long since learned to endure comments like these, to let them roll off my back without showing any outward reaction. But inside, I felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a stereotype, of being judged solely by the uniform I wore. Tunde turned to look at me briefly, his eyes flicking over me as if I were part of the furniture. I mean, look at her. Doesn't even talk to anyone. Probably doesn't speak English. More laughter followed, and I kept my gaze firmly on my coffee, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a response. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. But I swallowed it down. These people had no idea who I was or what I was capable of. They didn't know that the woman they were mocking was the very person who would soon hold their professional lives in her hands. The afternoon brought more of the same as I made my way through the office, performing my usual tasks. The condescension was almost unbearable. Kwame, still as dismissive as ever, called me over while he sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. "Hey, you," he said, not even bothering to look up as he waved me toward him. "The trash can is overflowing. Why don't you take care of that?" I walked over calmly, my expression blank. I glanced at the trash can. It wasn't even half full. I could feel the eyes of the other employees on me as Kwame continued to scroll through his emails, ignoring my presence with practiced ease. I took the bag out of the can, tied it up and replaced it with a new one. I said nothing, but the silence between us was deafening. As I turned to leave, I overheard Kwame muttering to a colleague, "I swear, these people are so slow, no sense of urgency. They probably think they deserve a raise just for showing up." The words echoed in my mind as I walked away. I had heard it all before: dismissal, dehumanization, the casual racism that seeped into the very fabric of the workplace. It was an all too familiar refrain in my life, one I had been forced to endure since childhood. But I knew something that Kwame and the others didn't. Endurance wasn't weakness, it was strength. Later that evening, after most of the employees had left for the day, I found myself alone in the office. I stood in front of the CEO's office, the door still bearing the name of the previous owner. In a few short weeks, that name would be replaced by mine, and the very people who had treated me like an afterthought would come to understand the weight of their actions. But for now I was still the cleaner, still invisible, and that was exactly what I needed to be. As I walked through the empty halls, I thought about the lessons I had learned over the years about patience, perseverance, and the power of silence. The people around me had no idea who I was, and that gave me an advantage. They couldn't comprehend that I had endured worse in my life. The insults and the casual racism were nothing new to me. What mattered was the end game, and I had always been a master strategist. I pushed my cart toward the exit, the night air cool against my skin as I stepped outside. The quiet of the evening was a welcome contrast to the noise of the day, and as I made my way to my car, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. In just a few weeks, the power dynamics would shift. The people who had mocked me would soon find themselves at my mercy, and I would have the opportunity to enact the change this company so desperately needed. But change took time, and for now, I had to continue playing my role. The next day, the tension in the office was palpable. Rumors of layoffs were spreading like wildfire, and the employees were on edge, unsure of what the future held. I knew that the time for action was drawing near. I had gathered enough information, endured enough humiliation, and now it was time to take the next step. As I entered the office, my mind was focused on the upcoming board meeting. The executives would be discussing the company's future, and I knew that their decisions would only make things worse. But this time, I wouldn't stand by and watch. This time, I would make my voice heard. The storm was coming, and I was ready. The morning dawned, grey, casting an ominous light through the glass windows of the office building. The usual buzz in the corporate halls was more subdued than ever, filled with murmurs of anxiety and speculation. Dressed in my janitor's uniform, I moved through the building as I had every day for weeks, but today felt different. There was a sense of impending doom in the air, a tension that rippled through every interaction, every conversation. Rumors of layoffs had spread like wildfire, and the whispers of impending disaster grew louder with each passing hour. Today, everything would change. I knew that this day would mark a turning point, not just for the company, but for myself as well. The upcoming board meeting would determine the corporation's future, and the executives would once again gather to make decisions that would affect hundreds of lives. They would discuss layoffs, budget cuts, and the possibility of closing entire departments. I had seen this scenario play out before, executives trying to salvage their own positions while sacrificing the jobs of those they deemed expendable. As I pushed my cleaning cart down the hall, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and resolve. I had endured the snide remarks, the condescension, the casual racism, all for this moment. It wasn't just about saving the company. It was about proving something to myself, to the employees, and to the world. I had observed the decay from the inside out, and now it was time to act. The boardroom, filled with sleek leather chairs and a long glass table, was already occupied when I entered to begin cleaning. The meeting was still an hour away, but the executives had gathered early, huddling in small groups, discussing the impending crisis in hushed tones. I recognized most of them by now, the same faces that had dismissed me as unimportant, irrelevant, nothing more than a fixture in the room. Kwame, as usual, was front and center, his loud voice carrying across the room. He was in the middle of what seemed to be an impromptu pep talk with some of the other senior managers, though his tone was more self-congratulatory than inspiring. "We're going to have to make some tough decisions today," he said, crossing his arms with a self-assured smirk. "But it's for the good of the company. We can't keep all these unnecessary people on the payroll. It's time to trim the fat." Several others nodded in agreement, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of anger as I wiped down the conference table. Unnecessary people. That's what they called their employees, as if they were disposable, as if their livelihoods didn't matter. I had seen the looks of fear and uncertainty on the faces of the lower-level workers, the same people who would bear the brunt of the decisions being made in this room. Kwame, oblivious to my presence as always, continued, "The janitorial staff alone could be reduced by half. We don't need so many people to keep the place clean. Hell, I bet we could outsource the entire department and save a fortune." I kept my eyes on the table, biting my tongue. I had heard enough over the past few weeks to understand the true nature of these people. How easily they dehumanized others, reducing them to numbers on a spreadsheet, statistics in a financial report. But today, I wouldn't stay silent. The hour passed quickly, and soon the room filled with the rest of the executives, all of them taking their seats around the table as the meeting was called to order. I moved to the corner of the room, blending into the background as the cleaner, my presence unnoticed by the powerful men and women who would soon decide the fates of their employees. The CEO, a man named Richard, stood at the head of the table, his expression grim. "We're in trouble," he began without preamble. "Our projections for the next quarter are worse than anticipated. If we don't take immediate action, we're looking at a total collapse. We need to cut costs across the board, and that means layoffs, deep layoffs." I listened carefully as the conversation unfolded, each executive presenting their own version of the same flawed solution. They talked about slashing jobs, closing entire departments, reducing benefits. Not once did anyone mention innovation, growth, or investment in the people who made the company run. It was all about cutting corners, saving their own skins while ignoring the long-term consequences. "I propose we start with the administrative staff," one of the executives said, glancing at the stack of papers in front of him. "We could reduce their numbers by at least 25%. That should give us enough breathing room for the next quarter." "And the janitorial staff," Kwame added quickly. "We could outsource that entirely. There's no need to keep them on payroll when we can get a third-party company to do the same work for half the cost." My grip tightened on the handle of my mop. I had heard enough. I knew now that if I didn't act, the company would spiral into a disaster that could have been prevented. The decisions being made today weren't about saving the company. They were about saving the jobs of the executives at the expense of everyone else. For weeks I had kept my identity hidden, observing, learning, and understanding the full scope of the problem. But now it was time to reveal the truth. I was ready to take control, but I needed to do it strategically, not out of emotion. As the executives continued their discussion, I quietly set my mop aside, and walked to the head of the table where Richard stood. I tapped him lightly on the shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest as I prepared to drop the facade I had maintained for so long. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady but firm. Richard turned to me, startled by the interruption, his brows furrowed in confusion as he looked at me, not recognizing the woman standing before him. "Yes, what is it?" I met his gaze without flinching. "I think it's time I spoke." The room fell, silent, all eyes suddenly on me. The executives exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what to make of the cleaner standing at the head of their table. Kwame, ever the opportunist, was the first to break the silence. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a private meeting. You have no business here." I didn't react to his tone. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope, the very envelope that contained the documentation of my ownership of the company. I had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see how far they would go before I revealed the truth. "I think you'll find that I have every right to be here," I said calmly, handing the envelope to Richard. "And as of today, I will be making the decisions that determine this company's future." Richard stared at the envelope in disbelief before tearing it open and scanning the documents inside. His face went pale as he read the words confirming me as the majority owner of the corporation. He looked up at me, his voice barely above a whisper. This can't be right." "Oh, it's very right," I replied, my voice steady as I addressed the room. "I've owned this company for weeks now, and I've been watching, listening, and learning everything about how it's been run, and I've heard enough to know that the decisions you're making will destroy it." The room erupted into chaos. Executives spoke over one another, trying to make sense of what was happening. Kwame was the loudest, his face red with anger as he stood up from his chair. "You can't do this. You're just a cleaner." I turned to him, my gaze cold and unyielding. "I'm not just anything. I'm the woman who now controls your job, your salary, and the future of this company. And I'll be making sure that people like you, people who think they can walk all over others without consequence, are held accountable." The room fell silent once again as the weight of my words settled in. I looked around at the faces of the executives who had dismissed me for weeks, the same people who had mocked me, ignored me, and dehumanized me. I had endured their arrogance, their racism, and their ignorance, and now I stood before them as their boss. The fallout from my revelation was swift and severe. As I took my seat at the head of the table, the power dynamic in the room shifted completely. The executives who had once held all the control were now scrambling to protect their positions. But I wasn't interested in preserving the old ways, so I was here to dismantle the rot that had taken root in the company and rebuild it from the ground up. My first order of business was simple: to ensure that those who had perpetuated the toxic culture were no longer part of it. Kwame and others like him would soon find themselves out of a job, and I would begin the process of transforming the company into a place where every employee, regardless of their role, was treated with respect and dignity. The boardroom sat in stunned silence, the air thick with tension as the weight of my revelation settled in. My eyes scanned the room, meeting each pair of stunned, disbelieving eyes with a calm, unwavering gaze. I could see the shock in their faces, the disbelief, that the woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a cleaner now held their fates in her hands. For weeks they had treated me with disdain, never imagining that I was the true power behind the company, and now their worlds were about to collapse. I let the silence linger for a moment longer, savoring the shift in power. The very people who had mocked and belittled me were now at my mercy, and they knew it. The air crackled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and anger, but no one dared speak. Not yet. Kwame, his face still flushed from the outburst moments earlier, was the first to break the silence. He shot up from his chair, fists clenched, eyes blazing with fury. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're just a cleaner. You can't come in here and act like you own the place." I turned to him slowly, my expression calm, my voice steady as steel. "But I do own the place, Kwame. I've owned it for weeks. long before you ever realized I was here, and during that time, I've seen exactly how you and others like you treat the people who make this company run." Kwame's face twisted in anger, but there was something else behind it now. Fear. He knew what was coming, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. I took a step toward him, my voice quiet but firm. "For weeks, I watched you belittle and demean the people who work here. You called them unnecessary. You said they didn't matter. Well, now you're going to learn what it feels like to be the one who doesn't matter." Kwame opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say another word, I raised my hand to silence him. "You're fired," I said coldly, my eyes locking onto his. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you out of the building." A wave of gasps swept through the room. Kwame's face drained of color as the reality of my words hit him. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice now tinged with panic. "I've been with this company for years. I know how things work here." I met his gaze without flinching. "And that's precisely why you're being let go. You've been here too long, Kwame. Long enough to think you're untouchable. But you're not, no one is." Before Kwame could respond, 2 security guards entered the room, standing by the door. I gave them a small nod. "Escort Mr. Kwame out of the building," I instructed, my tone firm. The guards moved toward Kwame, who looked around the room for support, but no one came to his defense. They were all too shocked, too fearful of losing their own positions. Kwame muttered under his breath as the guards led him out, but his protests were weak. His confidence shattered as the door closed behind him. The room remained silent, the tension palpable. I turned back to the rest of the executives, my expression unreadable. "Now," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "let's talk about the future of this company." Richard, still seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly rattled by the sudden turn of events. "Miss Amina," he began cautiously, "if I may, what exactly are your intentions here? I think we're all a bit unclear about the direction you plan to take." I nodded slowly, my gaze sweeping the room as I spoke. "My intentions are simple. This company has been in freefall for months, and the decisions you've been making are leading it toward collapse. I bought this corporation to save it, but I can't do that if the same toxic leadership remains in place." My words hung in the air, the implication clear. I wasn't just here to replace a few people. I was here to overhaul the entire culture. For too long, this company has been run by people who think they can treat others like they're disposable, I continued. "You talk about cutting jobs and outsourcing departments like it's nothing, but you've forgotten that behind every number is a person. You've forgotten that the success of this company depends on the people who work here. Not just the executives, but the cleaners, the administrative staff, the workers on the ground." My words were measured and controlled, but the passion behind them was undeniable. I had spent my entire career fighting against the kind of elitism and arrogance that I had witnessed in this company, and now I had the power to do something about the way this company has been run is unacceptable, I said, my voice firm, and starting today that changes. For the next hour, I laid out my vision for the future of the company. I explained my plans for restructuring, not through layoffs and budget cuts, but by investing in the employees who had been overlooked for so long. I spoke of innovation, growth, and long-term sustainability, concepts that had been sorely lacking in the discussions led by the former executives. Some of the executives listened in silence, still trying to process the dramatic shift in leadership. Others, clearly fearful of losing their positions, nodded along, eager to show their support for the new direction. But I wasn't interested in sycophants. I wanted real change, and I knew that that meant getting rid of the dead weight at the top. By the time the meeting was over, several more executives had been quietly dismissed, their severance packages already prepared. I had no patience for those who couldn't adapt to my vision, and I made it clear that anyone who wasn't willing to embrace the new direction would be shown the door. Later that evening, after most of the executives had left the building, I walked through the now empty halls. The office felt different now, quieter, almost peaceful. I knew that the changes I had implemented today were just the beginning. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of accomplishment. As I passed the office where my name would soon be engraved on the door, I paused for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. I had endured weeks of humiliation and disrespect, but it had all been worth it. I had seen the true nature of the people who had once held power in this company, and now they were gone. But more importantly, I had proven something to myself. I had always known I had the strength to succeed, but now I had the power to change the lives of the people who worked for me. I had the opportunity to create a company where everyone was valued, where no one was treated as disposable. As I stood in the quiet hallway, I allowed myself a small smile. The storm had come and gone, and I had emerged victorious. A week later, the company was buzzing with renewed energy. Word had spread quickly about the changes I had implemented, and the employees, those who had feared for their jobs, were now cautiously optimistic about the future. The toxic culture that had once pervaded the office was being dismantled piece by piece, and in its place, something new was growing. I sat in my new office, the view of the city skyline stretching out before me. On my desk was a stack of files, each one representing a new opportunity, a new direction for the company. I had always believed that leadership wasn't about titles or power. It was about the impact you had on the people around you. And now I had the chance to lead by example. As I picked up the first file, ready to dive into the work ahead, there was a knock at my door. It was one of the cleaners, a young woman who had been hired just a few days ago. She smiled nervously, clearly unsure if she should be bothering the CEO, but I waved her in. "Don't worry," I said, my voice warm. "What can I do for you?" The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. I've never worked at a place where people like me were treated with respect." My heart swelled with pride and I smiled. "You're welcome. And remember, everyone here deserves respect no matter what their job is." The woman nodded and left, and I sat back in my chair, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The work was just beginning, but I knew that together we would build something truly great, and this time no one would be left behind.